All right, let's get right into it. The 10 worst pieces of mixing advice out there. And if I miss one of your favorites or least favorites, let me know in the comments down below. I definitely want to hear from you. All right, the worst piece of mixing advice, number one, that I'm going to throw at you is this idea of don't compress too much, don't EQ too much, or maybe it's more specific. Don't compress more than 2 or 3 dB. Don't EQ more than 2 or 3 dB. You might hear numbers like that thrown out there. Maybe some more aggressive recommendations, don't compress more than 5 dB. And there are some common themes in all of this bad advice. And one of the big common themes in all this bad advice is that there's a grain of truth in most of this bad advice. Is it true that you can mess up sounds by compressing way too much? Absolutely. Is it true that you can make things sound worse by EQing way too much? Absolutely. Are there other things you should maybe do in your production or your arrangement or recording instead of doing gobs of EQ? Often, sure. But with that said, if you watch the way actual great mixers actually mix, sometimes they will turn around the knob backwards until it's ready to break off. And you will see great mixers doing amazing mixes that sound really, really good, doing 12 dB boosts on their EQ. Now, does this mean this should be your default? You'd put a 12 dB high shelf or low shelf boost on everything? Absolutely not, obviously. But it does mean that being too precious about your audio is potentially a crime against where your sounds could end up. So is it potentially good advice? Don't compress too much. Don't compress more than a few dB. Don't EQ more than a few dB. Potentially, if that's what you're doing is you're overdoing things all the time, absolutely. But I have often found in the people that I coach as mix coaching clients, or the people who send mixes to me to get mastered, the ones who are really struggling aren't usually struggling because they're over mixing and doing way too much compression and way too much EQ. They're usually struggling and unsatisfied with the results more often than not because they've taken this kind of advice about being too precious about your audio too much to heart, to the point where they're timid and they're afraid to make big, bold moves. And fair enough that when you're starting out, that you're likely to compress things maybe more than you should because you can't hear what the compressor is doing. And it takes a while to learn what a compressor is doing. But what this advice ignores is that the only way to find out how far is too far and what compression really sounds like is to compress too much. And to find out what bad EQing feels like, you've got to do it too much. And the only way to do this is to give yourself license to push things too far. And maybe once you've pushed things too far, you reel them back in a little bit. But the reality is that it's just not good blanket advice to try to do as little EQ and as little compression as possible. There are absolutely some genres, some styles, some productions where you're going to take a minimalist approach, and that's the right thing to do. But there can be some productions where you really got to do some gobs of EQ on a certain sound and give yourself the license to do that. And the only way to figure out which is by experimenting. And you're going to make some mistakes along the way, and that is okay. Now, the interesting thing with all this advice is that so much advice with mixing or anything else in music, an aesthetic art form, is relative. So if all of a sudden the thing that I'm telling you now that give yourself license to be heavy-handed and do too much sometimes, if that becomes the dominant mode of advice that people are hearing way too much, then that might become the bad advice down the road. So that's one of the themes that's going to come up again and again. In any of the bad advice you hear, there's probably a little grain of truth. And any of the good advice you hear, there's probably a little seed of destruction in there. So be aware of that. If you like that short clip, you might love the full-length video it came from, or you might love one of my full-length courses like Mixing Breakthroughs, Compression Breakthroughs, or Mastering Demystified, guaranteed to improve the way you work or your money back. Hey, if you want something totally for free, we've also got GPU Audio sponsoring this month. Check them out over at gpu.audio/sonic-scoop, where you can get a whole suite of plugins totally for free. Thanks for hanging out with me. See you next time.